Hey guys, snuggle in, dim the lights, and if you've ever had to improvise with a napkin in a public bathroom, prepare to meet your spiritual ancestors. Because tonight, we're diving headfirst into a topic that's somehow both horrifying and hilarious. What Victorian women used as tampons. That's right, tampons, Victorian style. Before there were pastel boxes promising you the confidence to ride a white horse on the beach. Before plastic applicators made you feel like a futuristic astronaut, people were out here cobbling together their own monthly solutions with whatever the 19th century had lying around. Linens, sponges, moss, sheep's wool, and the unbreakable spirit of someone determined not to bleed through 4 layers of petticoat at Sunday service. So before we descend into this cottonless chaos, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of bizarre bedtime history. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you're currently thankful for modern plumbing. I know I am. Now, dim those lights, turn on your fan for that soft, soothing hum, and get comfortable. You're about to fall asleep to the story of how half the Victorian population managed to survive menstruation with nothing but rags, sawdust, and the sheer will to pretend everything was fine. Let's get curious for a second. How did they deal with their periods while wearing 50 pounds of layered fabric? Did Queen Victoria herself ever talk about cramps? Were women just casually stuffing their drawers with sheep's wool like it was a normal Tuesday? And what was the Victorian equivalent of, "Sorry, I can't. I'm on my period. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1852 London. The air smells like coal, horse manure, and social repression. You're wearing 6 layers of clothing, a corset tight enough to keep secrets, and you've just realized it's that time of the month. Godspeed." Victorian society didn't talk about menstruation. They barely admitted it existed. Periods were treated like an embarrassing family secret, the kind whispered about in back kitchens or coded in letters as indisposition. If a woman mentioned her time, men fainted and women changed the subject to tea. You're living in an era where people believed emotions caused illness, tight corsets built character, and the word leg was considered too risque to say in polite company. So imagine trying to bring up the topic of uterine bleeding over dinner. Passing the potatoes, and by the way, menstruating was a one-way ticket to social exile. Even the word menstruation was taboo. Magazines and etiquette guides tiptoed around it with flowery euphemisms like the monthly visitor, the time of cleansing, or a certain period of inconvenience, because apparently calling it what it was might collapse civilization. For middle and upper-class women, privacy was everything. You were expected to maintain composure at all times, no matter what your uterus was doing. Fainting was acceptable. Crying quietly in a lace handkerchief was romantic. But admitting that your body was performing a completely normal biological function? Utterly scandalous. Even mothers often avoided explaining it to their daughters. The first period was less a rite of passage and more a jump scare. Imagine being 13, wearing 5 layers of cotton and wool, suddenly discovering blood, and thinking, well, that's it. I'm dying. Doctors didn't help much. Most were men who treated the female body like a mystical riddle wrapped in petticoats. Medical texts described menstruation as a monthly purgation of female impurities, which sounds less like a medical process and more like a haunted house ritual. One popular theory claimed the uterus wandered around the body when upset, causing hysteria, fainting, and, occasionally, what we now call needing a nap. Another insisted that women's mental capacities were reduced during their periods. Because obviously, nothing screams scientific rigor like she seems cranky, must be possessed by her own womb. Even the products that did exist to help women were wrapped in secrecy. Apothecaries sold ladies' absorbents or hygienic clothes, but you couldn't exactly stroll in and ask for them. You had to whisper, pay in cash, and receive your package wrapped in shame and brown paper. Stores even kept them under the counter, next to the condoms and moral regret. For those without access, or without the nerve to ask, a folded rag or piece of flannel would have to do. In households, women spoke in code. A servant might tell her mistress, "The linen basket is full again," which means you're bleeding through your fourth layer, my lady. Husbands were kept entirely in the dark. If a man discovered blood-stained fabric, he'd probably assume someone had been murdered by the help. Female friendships, however, operated as quiet support networks. A discreet nod, a knowing glance, and suddenly, a friend would slip you an extra cloth or some vinegar water for the cramps. The original girl code, minus group chats and heating pads. For poorer women, the mystery wasn't just social, it was survival. There was no room for delicate euphemisms when you lived in one room with 6 people and 2 goats. Privacy didn't exist, but shame still did. You'd rinse a rag in cold water, hide it behind the stove to dry, and pray the men didn't notice. The entire process was a balancing act between hygiene, secrecy, and humiliation. And if anyone complained of female troubles, the solution was usually prayer, laudanum, or being told to get married. Even literature played its part in pretending nothing was happening. Women in novels could faint, swoon, die dramatically of heartbreak, but never menstruate. Their bodies existed purely for beauty and childbirth, not biology. The blood of battle could be printed in vivid detail. The blood of womanhood was invisible. It wasn't until the very end of the century that medical reformers and early feminists began addressing the topic openly. Writers like Elizabeth Blackwell and Florence Nightingale quietly began publishing works on women's health that dared to say the word menstrual in print. The Victorian public was horrified. Doctors were divided, and women everywhere quietly exhaled, finally seeing their realities reflected on paper. Even if it was tucked behind Latin phrases and medical discretion. So yes, menstruation in the Victorian age was a mystery, not because it was unknown, but because everyone worked so hard to pretend it wasn't there. The real miracle wasn't that women endured it, it's that they did so gracefully, under layers of lace and expectation, in a world that refused to say the word blood, unless it was about war or Christ. They suffered, adapted, and whispered through the centuries, leaving behind not shame, but proof of endurance dressed as silence. And as you lie there tonight, drifting towards sleep, remember this. The Victorian world built entire walls of etiquette to hide the most natural part of life. But behind those walls, women kept living, bleeding, and quietly building the foundations of a world where one day you could walk into a store and buy a box of tampons without fainting or causing anyone else to. Imagine trying to manage period cramps while laced into a corset that restricts 60% of your lung capacity. Breathing is already a full-time job. Now your uterus has joined the rebellion. You can't slouch, can't lie down properly, and fainting is your only socially acceptable pain management technique. Victorian life was already a marathon of discomfort, but menstruation turned it into an Olympic event. The corset, supposedly a symbol of elegance and restraint, was also a torture device that squeezed internal organs into new shapes and left women fainting into decorative furniture. Picture it. Your stomach cramps are twisting like a snake in distress, but your torso is compressed into the approximate shape of an hourglass drawn by someone who's never seen a human body. Your ribs ache, your bladder has nowhere to go, and your uterus, that mischievous overachiever, is knocking politely on your spine. Doctors of the time were divided about corsets. Some claimed they supported the back and improved posture. Others, especially women who actually wore them, suspected they were slowly being folded in half. One 19th century physician even wrote that corsets helped stabilize the womb during menstruation, a bold claim for someone who thought the uterus wandered around like a lost puppy. In reality, corsets did the opposite. They cut off circulation, slowed digestion, and made cramping worse. Imagine trying to soothe period pain while being slowly compacted like leftovers in Tupperware. But you couldn't just loosen your corset. Heaven forbid. A woman seen in public without proper lacing was practically indecent. Fashion was morality. Appearance was virtue. If you dared to unhook a few clasps to relieve the pressure, society might assume you'd also murdered a clergyman. Women were expected to glide gracefully through life while their insides screamed for mercy. The fainting couch wasn't just an accessory, it was medical equipment. At home, you'd try to relax, but relaxation was a foreign concept. You might sneak away to your bedroom, loosen your stays just enough to inhale, and hope no one barged in. Maybe you'd use a hot brick wrapped in cloth, an early heating pad, to ease the cramps. It worked until the brick cooled and became just another hard object pressing against your abdomen. Herbal remedies were popular too. Chamomile tea, pennyroyal, and raspberry leaf. The problem was that most Victorian remedies came with side effects like dizziness, vomiting, or light hallucinations. Still, better than doing nothing, and doing nothing was often the only socially acceptable choice. Pain was moralized. Women were told to endure quietly, because complaining made you weak, and weakness was unattractive. If you couldn't handle cramps, how could you possibly handle childbirth, widowhood, or the emotional trauma of a slightly overcooked roast? The ideal woman smiled through everything. Grace under pressure, lace under agony. Let's not forget the layers: chemise, corset, petticoats, underskirts, overskirts, bodices, stockings, boots, and occasionally a decorative hat the size of a small dog. Each layer trapped heat and restricted movement. There was no curling up in bed during your period. There was standing perfectly upright and trying not to pass out during tea service. Even your digestion rebelled. Corsets pushed the stomach upward, making bloating worse. So while your midsection expanded in agony, your corset pushed back like, nope, not today. Men, meanwhile, considered women delicate for needing rest. They didn't realize women were functioning through levels of pain that would make a Victorian doctor prescribe immediate amputation. Husbands might notice their wives were pale and tired, but they assumed it was due to female nerves, not the medieval plumbing of their internal organs. And so the cycle, both literal and social, continued in silence. Some reformers did try to help. The rational dress movement of the late 1800s encouraged looser clothing, fewer layers, and breathing. Advocates argued that tight corsets caused fainting, organ displacement, and even infertility. Medical journals mocked them, fashion houses ignored them, but slowly, women began rebelling in small ways. Looser laces, softer fabrics, elastic waistbands. It was a quiet revolution fought one loosened string at a time. For working-class women, corsets were a different kind of trap. They couldn't afford the expensive whalebone versions, so they wore cheaper, stiffer ones made from metal or wood. Try harvesting crops, scrubbing floors, or sewing for 14 hours in that. Many loosened them while working, risking ridicule, because practicality always trumps propriety when you're trying not to pass out in a textile mill. By the late Victorian era, some women ditched corsets altogether, at least in private. Doctors started publishing studies about corset disease, a condition describing everything from shortness of breath to fainting to visible rib deformation. The public, of course, was scandalized. Women were blamed for vanity-driven frailty, as if fainting was a choice. Meanwhile, they just wanted to breathe through their cramps like normal humans. So yes, corsets and cramps were natural enemies. One demanded stillness and poise, the other demanded a heating pad and a week of solitude. The result was a delicate dance of endurance, a society built on repression and rib cages. But beneath those layers of lace and etiquette was something unbreakable. The quiet strength of women who endured all this and still managed to run households, raise children, write novels, and look impeccable while doing it. They were the original multitaskers, suffocating, cramping, and still expected to host dinner. So next time you stretch out in comfy sweatpants, remember, you're living the dream your great-great-grandmothers couldn't. You can breathe, move, and curl up in bed without fear of social scandal. Freedom never felt so soft. And nothing pairs better with menstrual cramps than oxygen. Before tampons and pads, most women relied on the humble rag, literally old scraps of linen, flannel, or anything soft enough to fold, bleed on, rinse, and reuse. The phrase on the rag wasn't just slang, it was laundry day with trauma. Imagine this. You wake up one damp London morning, your uterus already sending up a white flag. There's no box of modern pads on your nightstand, no tampons with clever commercials. Instead, you rummage through a faded drawer for a clean square of cloth, probably cut from last year's nightgown. This is your trusty monthly companion, softish, hopefully clean, and only a little bit unraveling at the edges. If you're upper class, it might even be embroidered. If you're working class, it might still have someone else's initials. Victorian women became experts in textile repurposing out of necessity. When a chemise or pillowcase finally disintegrated from years of use, it was demoted to personal linen. Nothing went to waste. A bit of flannel for extra softness, a patch of old cotton for absorption. The result wasn't pretty, but it was practical, until, of course, it had to be changed in the middle of a tea party or church service. Then, the real performance began. Swapping out a rag wasn't easy. No one discussed it openly, and bathrooms were rare and public. You'd slip away under the guise of freshening up and pray for a few private seconds behind a creaking door or curtain. Sometimes you'd have to wait hours, stewing in damp discomfort, trying not to let anything show through all those petticoats. If a stain did sneak past your skirt, you'd blame the mud, or, if you were feeling bold, an over-enthusiastic spaniel. Once used, the rag's journey had only begun. Cleaning it was an art form. Ideally, you'd rinse it right away in cold water to prevent stains from setting. A tip quietly handed down from mother to daughter. Soap was expensive and saved for visible laundry, so sometimes it was just water and elbow grease. After that, the cloths needed to be dried, but here was the dilemma. Hang them outside and risk the neighbor's prying eyes, or hide them in a dark corner and accept that fresh linen scent wasn't part of your life this week. Many women hid their drying rags behind stoves, under beds, or tucked in the rafters. Sometimes they never fully dried, leading to the charming aroma of eau de mildew that haunted Victorian bedrooms. God forbid a male member of the household stumbled across your stash. The level of panic was only rivaled by the Queen, herself announcing a surprise visit. Some girls were caught, forced to explain away those old cloths, and quickly learned to become even more covert with their menstrual logistics. There were, of course, alternatives. Rural women sometimes used moss or hay, though these were never as comfortable as the stories suggested. City dwellers might resort to layers of old newspaper in desperate moments, but ink smudges left more than just social stains. Still, the rag remained the gold standard, a bit of independence in a world that demanded silence and tidiness at all costs. Every month, this cycle repeated. Cut, fold, place, wait, hide, rinse, wring, hang, repeat. It was a routine that stitched generations together through shared experience and unspoken understanding. Older sisters whispered tips about folding and tucking for the best fit. Mothers taught daughters how to wash without leaving a trace. And through it all, women became logistical geniuses, planning their days around access to fresh cloth and places to hide evidence. Yet, for all its difficulties, there was a certain resilience forged in those routines. The rag system wasn't glamorous, but it was a quiet rebellion against discomfort, shame, and inconvenience. Women made do with what they had. And every wash and wring was a tiny victory over a society that wanted them to disappear for a week each month. So the next time you toss a pad in the bin or unwrap a tampon in a public restroom, remember the generations of women who managed with little more than scraps, soap, and stubbornness. Their ingenuity, patience, and laundry skills, passed down like precious heirlooms, were the unsung threads holding womanhood together, one monthly miracle at a time. Here's where things get messy, literally. Those reusable cloths had to be washed by hand, often in cold water, with no detergent, and then hung discreetly where no one could see them, because nothing said scandal like a drying bloodstain on the line next to the promised family's tablecloth. Washing menstrual cloths in Victorian times wasn't just a chore. It was a high-stakes, covert operation. Imagine you, standing in the dim morning light, nervously scanning the backyard to make sure no neighbor, or worse, your father-in-law, is nearby. You clutch a bundle of stained flannel, heart racing like you're hiding crown jewels. The reality? You're just trying to prevent a scandal, one rinse at a time. Laundry was already backbreaking, but period rags required extra secrecy. If you were lucky, you could sneak them into the regular laundry, camouflaged among socks and handkerchiefs. More often, you waited until everyone else was busy. Maybe you carried your bundle in a hidden apron pocket or wrapped it in another towel, careful not to leave a telltale spot on the floor. Stealth was key. There were rules, spoken and unspoken. Never let a man see the cloths, never let a servant gossip, never hang the rags where guests might glance out the window, drying them outdoors in full sun. Nature's best bleach was theoretically the most hygienic choice. But sunlight was also a spotlight, and the last thing anyone wanted was for Mrs. Pratt from next door to start speculating about the goings-on in your household. If you did risk an outdoor line, you hid the cloths behind sheets or petticoats, praying a gust of wind wouldn't expose your secrets. Many opted to dry them indoors instead, behind the stove, in the attic, or in a rarely used wardrobe. This led to all sorts of creative solutions, as well as the occasional musty smell that clung to a home like a guilty conscience. Cold water was the default for washing. No modern stain-fighting chemicals. No washing machines. Sometimes, women boiled the cloths for extra purification, which meant a kitchen that reeked of iron and old blood. If you had access to soap, you used it sparingly, scrubbing stains by hand on a washboard and hoping your knuckles wouldn't betray the evidence later. Poorer, women had it harder still. In communal tenements, privacy was almost non-existent. Shared washhouses became battlegrounds of gossip and side-eye. It was a risky business to scrub out stains in front of others, but sometimes there was no other option. In the countryside, women might wash cloths in streams or ponds, eyes peeled for nosy neighbors or local boys with nothing better to do. And heaven forbid you had daughters. Teaching them the delicate art of menstrual laundry was a rite of passage. passed on with whispered warnings, and the kind of practical advice never found in etiquette books. Rinse in cold water first. Scrub hard, but not so hard the fabric gives out. And always, always hide them before breakfast. The anxiety didn't end with washing. Once the rags were dry, they needed to be tucked away, folded, and stashed in secret drawers or boxes. A surprise visit from Aunt Matilda could send you scrambling, lest she stumble upon your stash while searching for spare candles. The fear of exposure was ever present, and for good reason. Rumours in Victorian communities spread faster than butter on a hot scone. Despite the hassle, most women developed a stoic efficiency. The laundry problem became part of the monthly rhythm, a silent ritual connecting mothers, daughters, and sisters through a shared challenge. And in a society determined to hide every trace of menstruation, even a clean rag was a badge of survival. So next time you load up your washing machine or toss a stained sheet into a detergent pod, remember the ingenuity and nerves of steel of the women who came before you. They managed their monthly mysteries with nothing but cold water, quick hands, and endless caution. Their labor, invisible and uncelebrated, deserves a moment of gratitude every time the spin cycle starts. In the late 19th century, some genius decided to make things easier by strapping pads onto belts worn around the waist. It was like wearing a harness of mild humiliation. They slipped, leaked, and made sitting down feel like straddling a loaf of bread. Let's set the scene. You, a Victorian woman weary from a lifetime of balancing linen rags and the expectations of society, suddenly hear rumours of a modern convenience making its way through the pages of a women's magazine or whispered at the local sewing circle. The sanitary belt. A new marvel, they say, for ladies' monthly protection. No more folding and tucking endless cloths. No more panic when the wind threatens to reveal your secrets on the wash line. You are intrigued. You are hopeful. You are, in hindsight, about to experience a new kind of misery. The sanitary belt, for all its supposed sophistication, was a masterclass in Victorian over-engineering. Imagine a wide elastic or cotton band worn tightly around your waist, designed to anchor a thick rectangular pad. This pad, often called a sanitary towel, was attached to the belt by tabs, pins, or, if you were feeling extra unlucky, tiny buttons designed by a sadist. Supposedly, it was secure, dignified, and modern. In practice, it was less modern hygiene and more Victorian escape room challenge. Getting into a sanitary belt took time, patience, and flexibility. You'd wriggle it up under your layers, chemise, petticoat, drawers, corset, overskirt, hoping to align the pad so that it covered what needed covering. The pad was about as absorbent as an old doormat, but about as flexible as a shingle. Every step, every twist, every sudden movement risked a misalignment that could only be described as catastrophic. Sitting down was its own adventure. The belt bunched, the pad shifted, and you became acutely aware of every buckle and seam in the vicinity of your dignity. Worse yet, early belts didn't always stay put. Victorian women found themselves in an endless, anxious shuffle, stand, discreetly tug at the belt, walk, try to nudge the pad back into place, sit, pray to all available saints for structural integrity. There was no elastic as we know it today. Some belts were made with stiff, chafing cotton or even leather. In hot weather, the band became a portable sauna, adding sweaty rash to your monthly list of complaints. And if the belt lost tension, well then you had a new household hazard, the rogue sanitary pad, slithering out of place at precisely the worst moment. Changing pads in public became a minor farce. In a world of communal bathrooms, outhouses, and lockless doors, removing your belt was as subtle as detonating a firecracker. You'd have to undress halfway, fish out the spent pad, and swap in a fresh one, all while pretending you'd just popped in to check your hair. It was a test of nerves, speed, and acting skill that would impress even the boldest of Victorian stage actresses. Despite the drawbacks, advertisements for sanitary belts promised freedom and discretion. "Now you may venture out with confidence," declared the flowery copy, illustrated with sketches of women riding bicycles or strolling in the park, all with suspiciously serene expressions. The reality? You moved stiffly, as if bracing for impact, and eyed every seat with suspicion. The belts did have one advantage over rags. The pads could be disposed of, if you could afford it, but most women still washed and reused the same bulky towels, soaking them in buckets or boiling them on the stove. The promise of convenience came at the price of comfort and dignity, and sanitary belts quickly developed a reputation for being only marginally better than nothing. Yet, the invention marked a turning point. It represented a tiny glimmer of progress, a willingness to acknowledge that women bled, that they needed help, and that maybe, just maybe, someone in the world was trying to make things a little less awful. In a society terrified of even mentioning the word period, a visible, wearable solution was almost revolutionary. So next time you sigh over an uncomfortable pad or a stubborn adhesive strip, think of your Victorian forebearers, strapped into their belts and marching on. The path to comfort is long and full of questionable inventions, but every buckle, pin, and awkward pad was one step closer to modern relief. And if you find yourself waddling a little on a tough day, remember, you're in very good and very determined company. Some women in rural areas used moss, hay, or newspaper as makeshift absorbents. Yes, newspaper, which sounds eco-friendly until you realize Victorian ink contained lead. So if the cramps didn't get you, the poisoning might. Some women in rural areas used moss, hay, or newspaper as makeshift absorbents. Yes, newspaper, which sounds eco-friendly until you realize Victorian ink contained lead. So if the cramps didn't get you, the poisoning might. Let's imagine, for a moment, that you're living far from the grand streets of London, in the rolling, muddy countryside, surrounded by more cows than people. Life is already a collection of daily improvisations. Your roof leaks. The roads are impassable half the year. Your only neighbour is a man named Bert, who believes onions can cure gout. When your period arrives, the idea of a soft, clean cloth for your monthly needs feels about as realistic as an indoor flush toilet. Enter moss. Nature's carpet, soft, green, and allegedly absorbent. Folklore from rural Scotland and the Nordic countries mentions using dried sphagnum moss as a menstrual pad. On paper, it's brilliant, it's free, it grows everywhere, and it's biodegradable. In practice, moss is nature's prank on anyone with sensitive skin. It crumbles, itches, and leaves you with a sensation best described as wearing a damp woodland on your undercarriage. Worse, if you picked it straight from the ground, you might find yourself sharing space with a colony of bugs. Nothing says feminine mystique like a sudden beetle cameo during a quiet afternoon. If you didn't have access to moss, perhaps because it was winter or because your brother used it to plug a drafty wall, the next alternative was hay. Hay is, as it turns out, an objectively terrible idea. Sure, it's everywhere, especially if you live above a stable or in a farming household. But hay is sharp, scratchy, and has the magical ability to travel to places it doesn't belong. A handful tucked between layers of underclothes could soak up a bit of blood. But at what cost? Splinters in sensitive places were not just possible, they were inevitable. As you limped around, you'd wonder whether the discomfort was worse than the original problem. In the cities, the ingenuity and desperation continued. Enter the newspaper. In the late Victorian era, Newspapers were cheap and ubiquitous. For women without money for rags or proper pads, a few sheets of the London Times or the Manchester Guardian could be folded, tucked, and pressed into service. If you were lucky, it was last week's paper, slightly softer and only marginally less toxic. Of course, the ink used back then wasn't designed for contact with, well, anything organic. Victorian newsprint was saturated with lead and other heavy metals, so every period became a gamble. Cramps versus chemical poisoning. Even so, some preferred it over nothing, and if you happened to bleed through, you'd be left with an editorial on the social reforms of 1872 smudged across your skin. Talk about making headlines. Then there were more creative, and often questionable, options. Some tried wood shavings, sawdust, or even scraps of old newspaper mixed with moss. Others resorted to whatever was on hand. Old leaves, dried grass, bits of felted wool, or, if truly desperate, just letting it flow and dealing with the consequences later. The human spirit is nothing if not inventive under pressure, and the Victorian period was, in many ways, an ongoing experiment in what won't chafe if you walk 3 miles to market. All these improvised methods came with a second wave of challenges. Cleanup. Unlike rags, which could be washed and reused, moss and hay had to be thrown away, preferably somewhere a dog wouldn't dig them up and parade them through the kitchen. Disposing of inky newspapers or a handful of hay required stealth, speed, and sometimes a good pair of tongs. The constant theme, of course, was shame. These methods weren't discussed, and you certainly didn't ask your neighbor for advice on the best moss for heavy days. Every woman figured out her own secret system, passing tips quietly from mother to daughter, or simply learning through trial, error, and mild dermatological trauma. Looking back, it's clear that necessity, resourcefulness, and the iron will to keep going powered generations of women through their monthly trials. If you ever feel inconvenienced by the cardboard applicator on a modern tampon, spare a thought for the countless women who braved beetles, splinters, and accidental op-eds just to get through the week. Their solutions may have been wild, but their determination was anything but. Wool was another popular choice. Soft, absorbent, and plentiful. Unfortunately, it also smelled like wet sheep and irritation. Combine that with the impossibility of proper washing, and you've got yourself a situation historians politely describe as unsanitary. Wool was another popular choice, soft, absorbent, and plentiful. Unfortunately, it also smelled like wet sheep and irritation. Combine that with the impossibility of proper washing, and you've got yourself a situation historians politely describe as unsanitary. If you were a Victorian woman, the odds were high that your home contained a spinning wheel, some battered knitting needles, and a basket of wool odd ends. Wool was everywhere: blankets, socks, shawls, underthings, and of course those mysterious ladies' cloths that nobody ever talked about but every woman recognized. The appeal was obvious. Wool is absorbent, reasonably soft, and, if you were clever, free. When a sweater wore thin or a baby blanket developed more holes than fabric, you simply repurposed the remnants. Out came the scissors, a little quiet snipping, and voila, the most private of personal hygiene tools. Of course, this was still Victorian England, which meant nothing involving the body could be acknowledged, let alone discussed. There was no instructional guide, no wool for women pamphlet discreetly slipped between the cookbooks. Girls learned by watching, experimenting, or whispering in code to an older sister. The sheep are in the meadow again, you might murmur, hoping the menfolk kept out of earshot. Your mother would nod and hand you a scrap. neither of you saying another word. Wool had its charms, but also its horrors. A new, well-felted piece could be soft and relatively unobtrusive, at least for the first hour. The trouble began with wear, with no disposable options. Every cloth had to be reused, and that meant rigorous, secretive cleaning. Washing wool was a logistical nightmare. It shrank, lost shape, and picked up every odor within a 5-mile radius. A not-so-fresh rag, after one rainy day, could leave you smelling like you'd been chased through a sheep pasture by your own bad decisions. Let's talk chafing. If you think a modern pad is bulky, imagine folding 3 layers of hand-knitted wool and tucking it somewhere decidedly unventilated. The result? A blend of friction, humidity, and a vague but persistent itch. Many a Victorian woman spent her monthly indisposition walking carefully, trying not to aggravate any delicate skin, and wincing at every unexpected movement. Wool fibers, as any knitter will tell you, have a mind of their own and a knack for finding the most sensitive places. The problem of washing never really went away. Most women boiled their cloths for purification, filling the kitchen with a smell best described as barnyard stew. But not everyone had the luxury of privacy, or the fuel for a long boil. In poorer households, the same rag might be rinsed in cold water, hung over the fire, and used again the next day. Whether it was truly clean or just less dirty than before. No wonder Victorian novels were full of references to fainting, headaches, and general malaise. The answer wasn't always emotional delicacy. It was, occasionally, a mild case of wool fatigue. The presence of rags and woolen cloths, hidden in boxes and tucked away in drawers, became a symbol of both ingenuity and repression. Women found themselves endlessly strategizing. How to change a cloth during a long church service. Where to dry it without prying eyes. How to keep the younger children from turning one into a doll blanket. Men, of course, were oblivious. They may have wondered why the household's wool budget never balanced, but they didn't ask. Asking meant risking an explanation, and no man in a waistcoat wanted that. Even with all these struggles, wool offered something important, a bit of autonomy. A woman with a stash of rags and woolen cloths was, in her own quiet way, taking charge of her health. Even when the world refused to acknowledge the need, this silent competence, repeated every month, built an unspoken camaraderie among women. They shared secret smiles and tips, trading advice about the best types of wool, the best way to avoid stains, the cleverest hiding spots. It was the original support group, centuries before hotlines or hashtags. Modern comforts can make us forget just how much energy, ingenuity, and sheer persistence went into surviving the most basic parts of daily life. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a lumpy pad or a subpar tampon, spare a moment for your ancestors, the ones who managed with rags, wool, and an ironclad ability to keep a straight face through it all. Their monthly rituals, full of itch, embarrassment, and endurance, were the quiet beginnings of every menstrual revolution to come. To keep cloths in place under layers of skirts and petticoats, women used safety pins, ribbons, and sometimes, God help us, string. Every month was an engineering challenge that ended in discomfort and mild blood loss not related to the actual period. To keep cloths in place under layers of skirts and petticoats, women used safety pins, ribbons, and sometimes, God help us, string. Every month was an engineering challenge that ended in discomfort and mild blood loss not related to the actual period. Close your eyes and imagine dressing for a Victorian day. The sun is barely up, your room is chilly, and you're already bracing yourself for battle. Today, that battle is fought with a handful of cloth pads, 3 lengths of mismatched ribbon, 4 tarnished safety pins, and a sense of ingenuity born from desperation. Menstruation in the 1800s wasn't just about hygiene. It was a monthly logistical puzzle with the stakes set at public humiliation if you lose. The goal? Keep everything where it belongs. At least until you can safely retreat to your bedroom. Sounds simple, but in a world of corsets, petticoats, bloomers, chemises, and more layers than a wedding cake, nothing ever stays put. Those woolen or linen cloths are thick and slippery. Even the most well-folded rag has a knack for migrating, bunching, or slipping sideways at the worst possible moment. Usually during church, a carriage ride, or in front of your most judgmental aunt. Enter the safety pin, a tiny invention that changed the game sort of. The safety pin, patented in 1849, quickly became the unsung hero of Victorian womanhood. You'd use 2 or 3 to fasten the ends of your pad to your underdrawers or to a makeshift belt, if you were lucky enough to own one. This belt could be a strip of muslin, an old corset lace, or, in truly dire moments, a length of twine borrowed from the kitchen drawer. The goal was stability, but the risk was ever present. A poorly fastened pin could come undone with disastrous results, and an accidental jab in a delicate place would leave you cursing the inventor's name with surprising creativity. When pins weren't enough, women turned to ribbons. Silk if you were rich, cotton if you weren't, a bit of frayed wool if times were truly hard. These would be sewn or threaded through small loops on the pad itself, tied around your waist or through the sides of your undergarments. If you tied the ribbons too tight, you risked cutting off circulation, or worse, creating a visible bulge under your petticoats, which was a social calamity. Too loose, and you'd be spending the afternoon with a warm, damp reminder of your own failed engineering skills. Some women improvised with buttons or hooks, but these methods rarely worked as advertised. Early advertisements for sanitary suspenders promised freedom and security, but the reality was a Rube Goldberg machine of shifting cloth and uncooperative fasteners. There are accounts of women rigging entire harnesses from scraps of old corset boning, hoping that if it worked for keeping in ribs, it might also keep in a pad. Sometimes it did. Mostly, it just left bruises in very inconvenient places. And let's not forget string, the last resort. String was for emergencies, for the mornings when you realized your favorite safety pin had vanished, or when all your ribbons had mysteriously tied themselves into unsolvable knots. A bit of string, threaded through the corners of the pad and tied around your hips, offered a little peace of mind, until it began to chafe, or until you remembered that it had just come off a bundle of onions from the cellar. The psychological toll of all this was enormous. You spent your day constantly aware of your own body, checking and adjusting, always worried about a telltale shift, or, even worse, a blood stain. Every sudden movement was risky. Running after a child, standing up too quickly, laughing too hard at a friend's joke. The tiniest miscalculation could mean a laundry emergency, a ruined dress, or a mortifying explanation to the laundress. But beneath the anxiety and mild injuries, there was a kind of unspoken pride. Women traded tips and tricks in quiet moments, passing along the secret wisdom of securing a pad for maximum effectiveness. Daughters learned from mothers, friends whispered their hacks in the back pews of church, and somewhere, every month, an experiment was born. Some new twist, knot, or fastening technique that just might keep disaster at bay. Modern period products may be more comfortable and discreet, but they're built on generations of clever women and their monthly inventions. The next time you grumble about a scratchy pad or a stubborn adhesive, remember your Victorian foremothers. Armed with little more than pins, ribbon, string, and sheer determination, they managed to make it through each day, holding everything together by any means necessary, sometimes literally by the skin of their teeth. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't show it. You couldn't even hint at it. Women were expected to simply carry on. If you fainted, you were delicate. If you mentioned cramps, you were unladylike. Basically, you suffered silently while pretending to enjoy embroidery. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't show it. You couldn't even hint at it. Women were expected to simply carry on. If you fainted, you were delicate. If you mentioned cramps, you were unladylike. Basically, you suffered silently while pretending to enjoy embroidery. In Victorian society, etiquette was everything, an elaborate code of behavior so dense it made the law look like light reading. From the way you poured tea to how you addressed your cousin's second husband's sister, every gesture was weighted with meaning. But nowhere was this more true than with the womanly troubles that visited every month. Victorian women became the ultimate illusionists, making pain and inconvenience disappear in a swirl of silence, starch, and social obligation. A true lady never mentioned her period, not to her husband, not to her friends, and especially not to a doctor, unless her life was truly in danger. Even the word pain was off limits. Menstruation was referred to in gentle euphemisms, my monthly, the visitor, or that troublesome time. Any direct reference was considered vulgar. It was as if the entire world had agreed to a mass hallucination. Everyone knew, but everyone pretended not to. If you needed to change a cloth, you didn't excuse yourself. You simply freshened up or went to attend to a little matter. Servants learned to interpret these vague signals, making themselves scarce at precisely the right moment. If you left a gathering and returned looking slightly paler, nobody dared ask questions. The possibility of a woman discussing menstruation was so scandalous that etiquette manuals warned against it in the same chapter as public drunkenness and loud laughter. Should you faint from cramps, an occupational hazard in a world of corsets and cast-iron morality, the most you could do was flutter your eyelashes, murmur about a touch of nerves, and accept a glass of cold water. Being delicate was oddly fashionable, but only if you made it look charming. Anything less was evidence of poor breeding or even moral weakness. The line between sympathy and suspicion was perilously thin. Etiquette extended to every detail. If you needed to wash a cloth, you did so with utmost discretion, timing your chores to avoid the gaze of menfolk and prying neighbors. You never hung anything damning on the line. A smart woman could dry a dozen rags in broad daylight and have them mistaken for dusting cloths. Privacy was a myth, but secrecy was an art form. Even within families, the silence was ironclad. Mothers might offer vague hints. "You'll know when the time comes, dear." But specifics were rarely shared until the moment arrived, usually with a combination of embarrassment, horror, and whispered advice in the scullery. Daughters learned to read the signs, the hidden drawer, the extra cloth in the laundry, the way their mother disappeared for a few minutes every afternoon. The pressure to maintain this perfect facade created anxiety at every turn. A bloodstain was a crisis. A misplaced rag could mean days of gossip. Every woman learned to check her skirts obsessively and to move with a slow, careful grace, just in case. If a misfortune occurred, say, a leak during church, there were unspoken protocols. Quietly leave, reappear with a shawl artfully draped. Never admit a thing. The polite fiction must be maintained at all costs. Etiquette also demanded that men remain entirely oblivious. Husbands might wonder at their wives' sudden pallor or temporary withdrawal from social life, but they'd never ask. Even male doctors were shielded from details, unless feminine troubles had become a dire threat to life and limb. For most men, menstruation was a hazy concept, referenced only as an explanation for a wife's nerves or indisposition. If pressed, they might mumble something about the moon. This elaborate dance of denial and discretion didn't just create stress, it shaped the rhythms of daily life. Women became masters of timing, choreography, and emotional endurance. They learned to mask pain with small talk, to distract suspicion with smiles, to disguise discomfort behind perfect posture and well-practiced demureness. Every month was a private struggle wrapped in lace, whispered away by etiquette, and endured with a stoicism that went entirely unremarked. Yet, there was a kind of solidarity in this silence. Women saw and supported each other in small, quiet ways. A sympathetic glance, a discreet handoff of a fresh cloth, a whispered warning about an impending visit from Aunt Flo. The unspoken rules bound them together, turning etiquette into both a prison and a shield. So the next time you roll your eyes at an awkward commercial or grumble about period talk, remember, for generations, etiquette demanded that women hide a core part of their lives in plain sight. Their suffering was made invisible by design, but their resilience was never less than remarkable. Every carefully worded excuse, every hidden rag, every stifled complaint was a silent act of survival, one that deserves a little respect, and perhaps a lot more honesty. Male doctors of the era had theories, terrible ones. They believed menstruation was the body's way of expelling emotional excess or releasing hysteria. Treatments included cold baths, electric therapy, and being told to think wholesome thoughts. Male doctors of the era had theories, terrible ones. They believed menstruation was the body's way of expelling emotional excess or releasing hysteria. Treatments included cold baths, electric therapy, and being told to think wholesome thoughts. Victorian medicine was a spectacle of earnest confusion, particularly when it came to the female body. Step into the well-appointed office of a Victorian doctor. Walls lined with dusty leather books, shelves of mysterious bottles, a faint whiff of carbolic acid in the air, and you, a woman suffering the perfectly normal agony of menstrual cramps, would be greeted with an impressive lack of practical help. Victorian medical wisdom for women was a dizzying cocktail of science, superstition, and wishful thinking. At the root of the problem, most doctors were men, and most had no idea what was happening inside a woman's body. Medical school lectures on menstruation were brief, vague, and, more often than not, conducted with a red-faced professor mumbling into his cravat. Many genuinely believed that the uterus was the emotional headquarters of the female soul. A wandering womb was blamed for everything from migraines to fits of melancholy. If you fainted at the sight of blood or suffered a bout of the vapors, it was simply your uterus making a run for it. That's right, your internal organs were considered prone to spontaneous road trips. When women complained of period pain, diagnoses ranged from nervous debility to hysteria, a catch-all term for anything doctors didn't understand. Menstruation itself was considered a pathological process, a monthly exorcism of emotional and physical toxins. The prevailing wisdom was that a woman's reproductive cycle was the root of her fragility, and that any attempt to live vigorously, study, work, or exercise could permanently damage her. Rest was prescribed, though not too much, lest it lead to sloth. And no, actual pain relief was rarely on offer. Suffering was just part of the female constitution. Treatments for menstrual discomfort ranged from laughably useless to downright dangerous. Cold baths were frequently suggested to calm the nerves. Imagine stepping into an icy tub while doubled over with cramps, desperately wishing for death, or at least a hot water bottle. Some doctors promoted electric therapy, involving mild shocks applied to the abdomen. This, they claimed, could stimulate the womb into better behavior. Unsurprisingly, most women reported only an increased desire to electrocute their physician. Dietary cures abounded. You might be told to avoid stimulating foods, spices, chocolate, tea, lest your womb get ideas above its station. Instead, you'd be advised to subsist on bland broths and plain bread, as if your uterus could be tricked into docility by a week of boiled cabbage. For the truly desperate, patent medicines offered relief in the form of laudanum, liquid opium, or Dr. Shillito's female pills, which promised to restore the menses and soothe the womanly nerves. They usually delivered a hefty dose of alcohol, morphine, or, on occasion, mercury. Side effects included hallucinations, addiction, and, naturally, continued suffering. If your symptoms persisted, or, heaven forbid, you talked openly about them, doctors might recommend a change of air. Off you'd be sent to the seaside, the mountains, or your Aunt Margaret's house in Yorkshire, where, surrounded by clean breezes and stony silence, you'd be expected to recover your female equilibrium. If this didn't work, the next step was often marriage, on the theory that regular conjugal relations would put your reproductive system in order, as if a husband's enthusiasm was the missing ingredient all along. Exercise was, predictably, discouraged. A little light walking was fine, so long as you didn't sweat, raise your heart rate, or threaten to outpace your chaperone. Sports, study, or professional ambition? Absolutely not. Overexertion might dry up the menses, or worse, cause the womb to migrate north, possibly resulting in lifelong melancholy and the inability to appreciate fine embroidery. Female doctors and reformers, a rare and radical breed, did begin challenging these ideas by the end of the century. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Elizabeth Blackwell, among others, insisted that women's ailments were real, not imaginary, and that a bit of rest, warmth, and empathy went further than a shock to the abdomen. They fought for better education, practical remedies, and, revolutionary as it sounds, for women to be believed about their own bodies. So, next time you pop an ibuprofen and curl up with a heating pad, send a silent thank you to the medical pioneers who banished the wandering womb and put real science into women's health. Because for too long, Victorian women endured the double misery of menstrual pain and medical mythology, surviving, as always, in spite of the experts. Because buying period supplies was shameful, women kept their rags and cloths in locked drawers or boxes. Some had euphemistic names like the monthly case, the linen reserve, or absolutely nothing of interest, father. Step into the Victorian home and you'll find an entire world constructed out of secrecy. It's not just the love letters tucked away or the sherry hidden behind the books. It's the little locked drawers, ornate boxes, and quietly mysterious trunks resting under beds and inside wardrobes. Nowhere was discretion more fiercely guarded than in the storage of menstrual supplies, a monthly ritual wrapped in wood, iron, and absolute silence. Picture your bedroom. Against one wall, a heavy oak dresser with brass handles, its lowest drawer locked tight. Inside, folded with precise care, are your menstrual cloths, some new and crisp, others worn soft from years of use. Perhaps they're wrapped in an embroidered linen towel or bundled in a faded silk handkerchief. If you're upper class, you might have a custom-made box with a delicate inlay, engraved with your initials, or adorned with painted violets. Working-class women, meanwhile, made do with what they had. An old biscuit tin, a wooden crate, a cigar box that once held contraband treats. The container didn't matter as much as the privacy it afforded. These were not just places to store rags. They were the guardians of a secret. Supplies were never left in plain sight. Etiquette demanded that they be hidden from husbands, brothers, and especially children whose curiosity threatened monthly disaster. Drawer keys were kept on a chain around the neck or tucked deep into an apron pocket. Sometimes a trusted maid or older sister was allowed access, but only after a whispered oath of secrecy. Victorian euphemism reached its creative peak when it came to labeling these storage places. Women invented code names to throw off suspicion. The monthly case was a favorite, as was the linen reserve. Some simply called it my things, or, in moments of exasperation, absolutely nothing of interest, father. Diaries and household account books included careful references to special linen or women's goods. All plausible, all quietly misleading. Even advertisements followed suit. Period products were never named outright, instead advertised as ladies' necessities or personal comforts, as if the object itself might faint from embarrassment. There was a ritual to the monthly unlocking. When the time came, you'd wait until the coast was clear, then open the secret drawer and select your supplies, making sure to close everything up tight before anyone could enter. The ritual felt both mundane and momentous. For a few minutes, you could admit to yourself what the world refused to acknowledge. This is normal, and you are not alone. And then, quick as a wink, everything was hidden away again. The importance of discretion seeped into every aspect of this monthly practice. Used cloths had their own systems. Perhaps a lidded chamber pot under the bed, a dedicated soaking jar kept behind a kitchen stove, or a pail tucked behind the wash house. Whatever the method, it was essential that the evidence be removed before prying eyes could see. Many a Victorian woman perfected the art of laundering by moonlight, washing her cloths when everyone else was asleep and hanging them to dry behind layers of less scandalous linen. The discreet drawer was more than just a hiding place. It was a fortress against shame. In a society obsessed with appearances, it allowed women a sliver of control, a sanctuary where they could manage their bodies on their own terms. Mothers passed down their drawers, boxes, and methods to daughters, who inherited not only cloth, but the secrecy that came with it. A mother's most important advice might be, always lock the drawer, dear, and never tell your father what's inside. Yet, within these private rituals, women found solidarity. Friends sometimes exchanged supplies or tips. I find flannel dries quickest, or boil everything in rainwater, always under the pretense of discussing household chores. In a world that treated menstruation as unspeakable, the discreet drawer became a quiet bond, a shared secret passed from one generation to the next. So the next time you open your bathroom cabinet and see a neat row of boxes, packets, and pads, remember the Victorian discreet drawer. A small rebellion against shame, an act of everyday resilience, and proof that even locked tight and hidden away, women always found a way to take care of themselves and each other. You'd think women might loosen their corsets during their periods for relief, but no, tight lacing was a social requirement. Fainting in public was more acceptable than being seen with an undone waist. Every sigh of pain was politely muffled behind lace. The Victorian corset was a feat of engineering and denial, an undergarment designed to deliver a perfect silhouette at the cost of physical freedom, and often basic comfort. If you're picturing a garment that could be casually loosened on difficult days, think again. Corsets weren't just underwear. They were morality, discipline, and status, stitched into a stiff shell of whalebone and cotton. Every morning, you were laced in tight by a mother, maid, or sister, and once bound, you stayed that way for hours, period or not. For Victorian women, the idea of letting out a corset to ease menstrual cramps was simply unthinkable. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about reputation. A loosely fastened corset hinted at slovenliness, laziness, even loose morals. If you were caught without proper lacing, tongues would wag, neighbors would gossip, and your good name might never recover. Tight lacing was a kind of social armor. It told the world that you were disciplined, respectable, and above all, in control of yourself. Even if your internal organs were staging a mutiny, this obsession with external appearance collided monthly with the harsh reality of menstruation. Imagine trying to manage cramps, bloating, and fatigue while squeezed tighter than a Victorian bank vault. Sitting gracefully was a challenge, breathing deeply, a luxury. If you slouched or leaned back, the corset's steel boning would jab your ribs. If you straightened, you risked dizziness and fainting from restricted lungs and compressed blood flow. And yet, maintaining perfect posture was required at all times. Your suffering had to be silent and stylish. For working women, there was no relief either. Factory girls, maids, shop assistants, all wore corsets, some as tight as their wealthier counterparts. A maid might loosen her laces while scrubbing floors or carrying buckets, but she'd re-tighten them the moment anyone important entered the room. It was an unspoken rule. Physical comfort came second to appearances, no matter your class. Every sigh, wince, or grimace during your period had to be hidden behind a well-practiced mask of composure. Victorian etiquette books advised women to bear discomfort with grace and fortitude, never revealing even a hint of distress. If you were truly overwhelmed, you might request to take the air or retire to your room, but only with a plausible excuse. The language of pain was forbidden, replaced with a delicate code, a touch of nerves, a little faintness, or simply the weather. Women perfected the art of signaling misery without ever speaking its name. Corsets didn't just intensify cramps, they also complicated basic tasks. Changing a cloth or pad meant wrestling with an impenetrable cage of laces, hooks, and stiff fabric. You might spend 10 minutes undressing just to reach your underclothes, each layer a fresh challenge to dignity and patience. And once you were finished, you'd have to redo the whole assembly, tightening everything back into place with trembling hands and a forced smile. The tension between bodily need and social expectation led to ingenious, if secretive, acts of rebellion. Some women snuck away for a moment's relief, loosening a lace, shifting a busk, or even removing the corset entirely for a precious minute behind a locked door. These moments of comfort were rare, risky, and never, ever discussed. The true measure of a Victorian woman, so the world insisted, was her ability to suffer beautifully. Even as the century progressed and the rational dress movement gained followers, most women still found themselves bound by both fabric and expectation. Doctors warned of the dangers of tight lacing, corset liver, fainting spells, and permanent deformity, but social change was slow. A looser corset might be permitted in private, but for public life, the armor remained. So, next time you grumble about an uncomfortable bra or the pinch of shapewear, spare a thought for the millions of women who spent their periods encased in boned, unyielding shells, expected to look serene and effortless. The corset wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a daily exercise in endurance, willpower, and the quiet, stubborn strength that defines every generation of women, whether laced in whalebone or simply living life on their own terms. In 1888, Johnson & Johnson introduced Lister's towels, the first disposable sanitary napkins. They flopped spectacularly. No store wanted to stock them because women were too embarrassed to buy them. Imagine trying to discreetly ask for them in a Victorian pharmacy while a man with mutton chops judged your soul. Let's travel back to the late Victorian era, a time bursting with new inventions, from the light bulb to the telephone, to, at last, a product that promised to liberate women from the tyranny of the monthly wash, the disposable pad. Johnson & Johnson, purveyors of all things hygienic, introduced Lister's towels, marketed as a modern miracle for women's health. The idea seemed revolutionary. No more boiling rags or hiding cloths behind the stove. Just use and toss. For the first time, convenience arrived at the pharmacy counter. Or rather, it would have, if women had been able to muster the courage to actually buy them. Victorian women, you see, were raised to treat menstruation as their deepest secret. Even the whisper of ladies' towels in a shop was enough to send one's cheeks flaming. Period supplies were kept hidden in drawers, euphemized in code, and purchased with the discretion of a Cold War double agent. The very act of approaching the counter to request a box of Lister's towels meant risking exposure not just of your monthly needs, but of your womanhood itself. To buy a disposable pad in 1888, you had to first locate a chemist who stocked them. This was no easy feat, as many shopkeepers were so mortified by the idea of selling menstrual products that they simply refused to display them at all. Some hid them under the counter, available only by special request, and, sometimes, a whispered password. Others refused outright, insisting that such personal articles were best left to the privacy of the home, as if the products themselves might faint dead away from embarrassment. If you managed to work up the courage, the purchasing process was its own exercise in social anxiety. Imagine you, clutching a coin purse, standing in a pharmacy lined with glass bottles and curious onlookers. You lower your voice to a whisper and request Lister's towels, hoping no one is within earshot. The male chemist, who likely has never spoken to his own wife about her monthly, glares over his spectacles and raises a judgmental eyebrow. Perhaps he reaches beneath the counter, wraps the package in extra brown paper, and slides it across with all the ceremony of a criminal handoff. The transaction ends with both parties vowing never to speak of it again. But the obstacles didn't stop there. The pads themselves, while innovative, left much to be desired. Early Lister's towels were bulky, made of cotton wadding between gauze layers, and as absorbent as a bath mat. They came with no adhesive and no reliable way to stay in place. Most women wore them with a belt or pinned them to their undergarments, a method not known for stability. There were leaks, there were slips, there was, above all, the risk of discovery, both literal and social. The cost was another barrier. Disposable pads were not cheap, and for many working-class women, the idea of spending good money on something to be thrown away seemed both wasteful and decadent. Victorian thrift was legendary. Nothing was discarded lightly. Why purchase a box of Lister's towels when a rag could be rinsed and reused for years? Waste not, want not, as every penny-pinching matron would remind you. Despite Johnson & Johnson's best efforts, the world simply wasn't ready. Sales were abysmal. Even magazines that advertised the product resorted to coy language, offering comfort for delicate days without ever explaining what the towels were for. It would take decades, 2 world wars, and the arrival of female shop assistants before the disposable pad found its place on store shelves and in women's lives. Yet, the story of Lister's towels is not just a tale of marketing gone wrong. It's a reminder of how stubborn social taboos can outlast even the cleverest inventions. For all their discomfort, inconvenience, and secrecy, Victorian women proved, once again, that endurance was their true superpower. Even a disposable pad couldn't improve overnight. Upper-class women could afford clean linens, servants, and doctors. Working-class women? They used whatever they could find, wool scraps, straw, or nothing at all. Many simply let it flow naturally under long skirts, which is romanticized by no one ever. Victorian England was an empire of social hierarchy, and the world of menstruation was no exception. While polite society liked to pretend periods didn't exist, Every woman, regardless of status, had to contend with them. How she did so depended entirely on her position in the great, grinding machinery of class. If you were born into privilege, your period might still be a monthly ordeal, but at least it was cushioned by comfort. Clean linen rags were always on hand, laundered by a discreet maid who would never dream of gossiping. Well-off ladies could afford to hide their monthly things in locked drawers, inside decorative cases, or tucked among layers of perfumed handkerchiefs. Should you find yourself in distress, a hot bath could be prepared, along with a fresh gown, and, if pain was bad enough, a visit from the family doctor who would diagnose you with nervous exhaustion and prescribe bed rest, laudanum, or a week by the sea. Upper-class women were also granted a degree of privacy that most working-class women could only dream of. If you needed time away from the drawing room or parlor, you could simply retire to your own bedroom, where no one would question your absence. With money came space, and with space came the rarest luxury of all, the ability to suffer in peace. Even so, etiquette dictated silence. The only thing less discussed than menstruation was the work of the servants who made its inconveniences disappear. For the vast majority, life was harsher and choices were limited. Working-class women, living in crowded flats or country cottages, lacked both privacy and resources. Rags were whatever you could find. Scraps of flannel, old shirts, even bits of sackcloth repurposed when nothing else was available. If cloth was too precious to be wasted, hay or moss from the fields might do. In the worst cases, women simply bled into their clothing, trusting long dark skirts to hide the stains. Free bleeding wasn't a movement. It was the only option when supplies ran out. Washing menstrual rags posed its own set of humiliations. Shared tenement washhouses were hotbeds of gossip and side-eye. You learned quickly to hide your cloths among other laundry or to do your scrubbing after dark, hands chapped red from cold water and lye soap. In rural areas, women rinsed their rags in streams, forever scanning the hedges for curious children or nosy neighbors. Any slip in discretion meant whispers, shame, and sometimes outright ridicule. Pain management, too, followed class lines. For a wealthy woman, cramps could be soothed with hot bricks wrapped in towels, herbal teas, or even visits from a private physician. For a working woman, you gritted your teeth and kept going, through 14-hour factory shifts, up and down the stairs, out into the fields. Time off was unthinkable. If you collapsed from exhaustion or pain, there was no fainting couch. You simply hoped no one noticed. The contrast extended even to information. Daughters of the upper classes, though still kept in ignorance, might at least receive a private, embarrassed talk from their mothers, or a letter explaining the basics. For the poor, menstruation was learned the hard way, through accident, embarrassment, and whispered advice among sisters, friends, or sympathetic neighbors. The privilege gap shaped not only how women coped, but how they were judged. A bloodstain on a lady's dress was an accident, quickly and quietly remedied. On a servant or factory worker, it was a mark of carelessness, or, worse, a lack of moral character. The world expected working women to be invisible, uncomplaining, and above all, clean, even when circumstances made that impossible. Yet, through all this, women found ways to persist. They built networks of quiet solidarity, trading cloths, sharing tips for hiding stains, covering for one another when cramps became unbearable. Whether in the grandeur of a townhouse or the cramped chaos of a tenement, Victorian women survived their periods with the materials at hand, the knowledge they could scavenge, and the stubborn will to keep moving, no matter what. So the next time you see a box of pads in every supermarket aisle, remember, that kind of access is new, hard-won, and for centuries, utterly unthinkable for most. Period poverty isn't just history, it's the hidden reality that shaped women's lives, one quietly laundered rag at a time. Perfume wasn't just for flirting, it was strategic. Victorian hygiene standards were already low, and menstruation added a new layer to the bouquet. Lavender sachets, rose oil, and vinegar dabs under corsets masked what society refused to acknowledge. Let's be honest, the Victorian era was not known for its fresh, floral ambience. Between coal smoke, chamber pots, unwashed linens, and a national allergy to open windows, every room had a signature aroma, usually something between damp cellar and horse barn after a rainstorm. Into this already fragrant mix came the practical challenges of menstruation. For most women, managing the monthly wasn't just about containing blood, it was about hiding every possible trace: sight, sound, and especially scent. Rags, wool, and improvised pads didn't just absorb, they harbored odors, especially when washing options were limited. In an era where laundry was a luxury and privacy was rare, used cloths often spent hours, sometimes days, waiting their turn in the wash, tucked under beds, behind stoves, or at the bottom of laundry baskets. In the summer, the smell could be positively defiant, fighting its way through layers of skirt, petticoat, and corset to make itself known. It was a new, distinct anxiety for women who were already tiptoeing through a minefield of etiquette. Enter perfume, the not-so-secret weapon of every Victorian lady. Scented handkerchiefs were as vital as a good bonnet. Lavender was a favorite, both as a sachet to tuck into drawers and as a drop or two on collars and cuffs. Rose oil came in tiny glass bottles, ready to dab onto pulse points or, more strategically, onto the band of a sanitary belt or the corners of a menstrual rag. Even inexpensive colognes and toilet waters, diluted with spirits, found their way into undergarments and linens, masking any hint of female inconvenience. For those who could afford it, perfumed soaps offered another layer of protection, though actual bathing was infrequent, perhaps once a week for the luckiest. Women made do by spot cleaning with scented cloths. Vinegar was a favorite deodorizer, despite its eye-watering sharpness, because it reliably overpowered more embarrassing odors. If you ever wondered why some Victorian ladies fainted so often, try standing up too quickly after dousing your corset with vinegar and lavender oil. Upper-class women could employ perfumed powders made from crushed orris root, violet, or musk, which they'd sprinkle on the body and inside drawers. These scented powders provided a cloud of plausible deniability and helped maintain the fiction of perpetual freshness. No one would dare comment if you seemed especially fragrant during delicate days. In fact, heavy scent was taken as a sign of refinement and social standing, a coded message among women that only they truly understood. But for working-class women, perfume was a rare indulgence. Most made do with sprigs of mint, dried lavender from the garden, or, if nothing else, a hard scrub and a prayer. Some would boil their rags in water scented with herbs, hoping to neutralize the worst odors before the next round of use. Others simply endured, relying on the camouflage of crowded rooms and the democratic nature of poor sanitation. If everyone smells, no one can single you out. The social dimension of scent was its own ordeal. The terror of being discovered haunted every interaction. A neighbor leaning in too close, a male relative sniffing the air suspiciously, a sharp-nosed landlady. Anyone could become an accidental detective. Every trip out in public required extra planning, extra scent, extra vigilance, extra anxiety. If a woman was ever accused of being ripe, her reputation might never recover. This was a world where a whiff could mean exile from polite society. Through it all, women shared secret wisdom. Mothers passed down recipes for homemade rosewater. Friends compared notes on which perfumery in town had the strongest blend. Sisters swapped little sachets, tucked into pockets and petticoats, in acts of solidarity more potent than any social gathering. So next time you spritz your favorite scent, remember that for Victorian women, perfume was more than luxury or flirtation. It was armor, a mask, and sometimes a lifeline. It was the final veil in the endless campaign to keep womanhood's oldest secret, one drop of lavender at a time. Victorian men were largely clueless about menstruation. Husbands often thought their wives had female fevers or delicate conditions. Some genuinely believed periods stopped after marriage, as though the uterus just clocked out permanently. Marriage in Victorian England was a theatre of appearances, and nowhere was the curtain drawn tighter than over a woman's body and its monthly routines. Men, shielded by etiquette and blissful ignorance, had little idea what their wives endured each month. Most had never been told about menstruation in their youth. Mothers were tight-lipped. Sisters changed the subject. And even schoolbooks tiptoed around the subject, focusing instead on the poetry of spring meadows and the noble adventures of young lads. The closest many men came to the truth was a vague understanding that women sometimes felt unwell or required more rest. Once married, this ignorance persisted, fortified by an army of euphemisms. When a wife withdrew from social events, complained of a headache, or spent an afternoon lying down, a husband might attribute it to nerves, female weakness, or simply the weather. Wives, in turn, became masters of the art of evasion. Why ruin the illusion of constant grace and composure with talk of cramps, stains, and the intricate choreography required to keep a pad in place during a waltz? The idea that marriage would somehow cure or end menstruation was surprisingly widespread, especially among men. Some believed it was nature's way of preparing a woman for childbearing, and that once her maternal duties commenced, the monthly visits would fade away. Never mind basic biology. Victorian advice columns and marriage guides often reinforced these myths, warning husbands to be gentle with your bride should she be unwell, but never clarifying what unwell actually meant. This lack of knowledge had real consequences. When a wife suffered debilitating cramps or heavy bleeding, her distress was often dismissed as overreaction or hysteria. A woman who dared mention her period risked not only embarrassment but also accusations of impropriety. It was thought unseemly, even unnatural, for a woman to refer openly to her body's functions, especially in the company of her husband. For many, it was easier to suffer quietly and maintain the pretense of perpetual composure. Not all men were willfully oblivious. Some cared deeply for their wives and grew concerned about their cyclical ailments, seeking the advice of family doctors or midwives. But even medical professionals frequently used coded language, describing menstruation as the monthly course, the visitation, or the time of flowers. Husbands might nod along, none the wiser, grateful only that it was someone else's business to manage. Meanwhile, in some marriages, the lack of knowledge bred superstition and fear. A husband stumbling upon a blood-stained cloth might panic, suspecting illness or even infidelity. A wife's bad temper during certain days of the month could be interpreted as a character flaw rather than the result of pain and exhaustion. The distance between the sexes, maintained by social mores and willful ignorance, became a chasm at the very time women most needed understanding and support. Yet, within these constraints, women developed their own networks of empathy and support. Sisters, mothers, and friends shared advice, comforted each other, and swapped stories about clueless husbands behind closed doors. There was humor too, quiet jokes, rolled eyes, and the unspoken camaraderie of surviving another month in a world determined to ignore reality. So the next time you hear someone joke about men not understanding periods, remember that it's not just a modern complaint. It's a tradition with roots in centuries of secrecy. And while today misunderstandings may be annoying, at least now the conversation can happen out loud. Without painkillers, heating pads, or comfort food, cramps were treated with leeches, brandy, or fainting. Laudanum, basically Victorian morphine, was the go-to. So if you weren't writhing, you were high as a kite and knitting your own hallucinations. Victorian period pain was a full-body event, equal parts biology and bravado. When cramps hit, there was no discreet trip to the medicine cabinet. No ibuprofen, no chocolate stash, and definitely no microwavable owl-shaped heat pack. Instead, you'd brace yourself for a wave of discomfort and hope you could pass it off as nerves. Society expected women to suffer in silence. But silence didn't do much for a uterus in open rebellion. The most modern treatment on offer was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, widely prescribed for everything from toothaches to teething babies. Women with severe cramps might find themselves floating in a pleasant haze, only vaguely aware of the world around them. Pain became something distant, occasionally replaced by vivid dreams or an urge to recite poetry to the curtains. But laudanum was addictive, unpredictable, and not always available. It was just as likely to send you to bed with the chills as it was to grant sweet relief. If opium wasn't an option, you might reach for the bottle of brandy, tucked away for medicinal purposes. A shot of spirits dulled the edge of pain and, if you were lucky, made you less concerned about your rigid corset and the world's unfairness. A second glass, and you might actually believe the doctor's advice that a brisk walk and cheerful thoughts were all you needed. Of course, Victorian medicine also delighted in the bizarre. Leeches were a classic remedy for almost everything, and period pain was no exception. The theory was that excess blood caused cramps, so letting out a little with a leech or a lancet would restore balance. The practice was, as unpleasant as it sounds. A woman might sit, eyes closed, as a leech was applied to her skin, all the while praying for numbness. If that failed, she could always try a mustard poultice, a spicy paste smeared across the lower belly, which stung, burned, and did little to distract from the cramps. In households without access to medicines or medical advice, period pain was treated with folk remedies passed down through generations. A hot brick wrapped in a towel, ginger tea, or a sprig of lavender tucked into the corset. All provided more comfort by ritual than by science. Some women swore by pennyroyal or raspberry leaf infusions, while others relied on distraction, needlework, singing, or reading the Bible by candlelight, and then there was fainting. Sometimes the pain simply became too much, and a well-timed swoon onto a convenient settee offered both a bit of relief and a socially acceptable excuse for a day spent horizontal. Society expected women to be delicate, after all. A dramatic collapse was almost the only way to express suffering without being accused of exaggeration or worse, indecency. Most often, however, women just endured. Complaints were discouraged, and the expectation was stoic resilience. You worked through the pain, cooking, cleaning, chasing children, and serving tea, while pretending nothing was wrong. The women of the Victorian era became experts at disguising discomfort, mastering the art of the tight-lipped smile and the quick, quiet gasp behind closed doors. It's easy to take modern relief for granted until you imagine surviving period pain armed only with leeches, laudanum, and stiff upper lip. So tonight, as you reach for a heating pad or painkiller, think of those who came before, who handled the worst days with courage, creativity, and occasionally, a slightly drunken prayer for mercy. Between crinolines, petticoats, and 14 layers of fabric, changing a cloth midday was a logistical nightmare. You'd have to undress, like a Russian nesting doll. Imagine trying to discreetly do that in a freezing outhouse with no light. Victorian women's fashion was famously elaborate. Skirts wide enough to block doorways, sleeves that could smuggle a week's worth of scones, and more buttons, hooks, and ties than a haberdasher's fever dream. But add menstruation to the mix, and the result was less elegant society lady and more escape artist with a bladder problem. If your period arrived at an inconvenient moment, and it always did, the simple act of changing a pad became an epic challenge. The average outfit started with a chemise, stockings, and drawers. On top went a corset laced as tight as you could bear, followed by a petticoat or three, an underskirt, an overskirt, and finally the outer dress or bodice. Some women added a crinoline, an enormous hoop-shaped cage designed to make skirts stand out, just to complicate things further. Getting dressed took time. Getting undressed was a full-body project that required patience, flexibility, and, if you were lucky, a friend with nimble fingers and no questions. Now, picture the scene. You're at a dinner party, church service, or heaven forbid, traveling by carriage across muddy roads. You realize you need to change your cloth, and soon, the options are grim. If you're at home, you might manage to slip away to your bedroom and undress in relative privacy. But out in the world, public bathrooms as we know them simply didn't exist. Most venues offered little more than a chilly outhouse or closet-sized privy, unlit, unheated, and not exactly sanitary. In such circumstances, the process turned into a game of speed and stealth. First, you'd need to undo dozens of hooks and buttons, wriggle out of your corset just enough to reach your undergarments, and balance yourself in the semi-darkness. All the while, you hoped that no one knocked on the door or called your name. If you dropped a pin or a pad, heaven help you. Retrieving it from the sawdust-covered floor was a test of determination. And, afterward, luck in avoiding splinters in unwelcome places. Accidents were inevitable. Bloodstains might seep through layers of petticoat and make a surprise appearance on your favorite dress. Long skirts hid a multitude of sins, but not all. Many women perfected the art of strategic shawl placement, quick repairs, and the dignified retreat. It was less about being accident-free and more about managing disasters with as much poise as possible. Then there was the weather. On hot days, layers trapped sweat and smells. On cold days, everything felt damp and clammy. Changing out of wet or soiled pads was sometimes impossible until you returned home, which meant hours of discomfort, anxiety, and often chafing. The only consolation? You were far from alone. Every woman in the room was dealing with the same risks, united in silent, slightly itchy solidarity. Victorian fashion may look glamorous in portraits, but behind the lace, velvet, and polished boots was a world of inconvenience and secret suffering. So the next time you slip into a stretchy skirt or sweatpants on your period, thank the trailblazers who survived 19th century fashion disasters and did it all without so much as a zipper. Religious beliefs at the time still painted menstruation as unclean. Some churches discouraged women from taking communion or attending services while bleeding, because nothing says divine compassion like exiling someone for biology. In Victorian England, the church was not just a place to pray. It was the centre of moral life, setting the tone for what was considered pure and proper. For women, this meant that menstruation was not merely a physical inconvenience, but a spiritual one. Centuries-old ideas about women's uncleanness persisted, woven deep into sermons, scripture readings, and church rules. Even as scientific knowledge crept forward, the pulpit clung tightly to tradition. And tradition was, frankly, not on your side if you were menstruating. Church doctrine had long connected menstruation to ritual impurity. The Book of Leviticus, often cited by Victorian preachers, described women as unclean during their cycles, requiring days of separation from the community. While not every parish enforced literal isolation, the stigma lingered like incense smoke. The unspoken rule: when you were indisposed, you were expected to keep a low profile. Some women were quietly encouraged to skip services, sit in the back pew, or avoid Holy Communion altogether until they were deemed clean again. For devout women, these restrictions were not just humiliating, they were isolating. Imagine rising early on a Sunday morning, dressing in your best, and feeling the subtle chill of disapproval from older churchwomen, or a stern-eyed curate if you dared show up during your time. Whisper networks would circulate, "She's unwell, poor dear," or "It's not her week for communion." The message was clear: your body was a problem, and the solution was absence or invisibility. This was especially hard for women whose social lives revolved around the church. Weekly services, teas, charity work, and singing in the choir were chances to see friends, seek support, and participate in the rhythms of community. Exclusion for a week, or more, if your cycle was long, could mean missing news, falling behind on gossip, or feeling suddenly apart from the life you loved. Even more hurtful was the way spiritual authority reinforced shame. Being unclean wasn't just physical. It hinted at moral failing, weakness, or a lack of self-control. Not every parish or denomination enforced these ideas equally. More liberal or urban churches sometimes turned a blind eye, especially as women's social roles began to shift. But in many small towns and conservative communities, the traditions were as rigid as the wooden pews. Even when the rules weren't strictly followed, the atmosphere of discomfort persisted. The simple act of sitting through a sermon became fraught with anxiety. What if someone noticed? What if you were found out? Women devised clever ways to attend without drawing attention. Sitting at the end of the pew, timing their visits, or volunteering for tasks that kept them out of sight. Priests and ministers, almost always men, rarely discussed the issue openly. When the subject did come up, it was wrapped in euphemism: ladies' difficulties, that time of the month, or, if you were really lucky, the monthly affliction. Medical advice handed down from the pulpit was equally vague, offering prayers, herbal teas, or moral fortitude as remedies for cramps and inconvenience. The reality, of course, was that women found comfort and counsel from each other, sharing wisdom in whispers after services or during ladies' sewing circles. Despite these barriers, Victorian women's faith was often unshakable. They adapted, endured, and found ways to remain part of the church community, even when traditions tried to push them out. Their quiet resilience, week after week, turned the curse into just another trial to be survived. Sometimes with grace, sometimes with frustration, but always with an unbreakable will. So the next time you step into a place of worship, remember the generations of women who sat in the back, quietly present even when told to disappear. Their perseverance helped soften those old rules, making space for a little more compassion and a lot less shame. Early ads for ladies' sanitary goods didn't use the words blood, menstruation, or tampon. They used poetic nonsense like a comfort for those delicate days or protection for feminine health. Victorian marketing was basically gaslighting in cursive, In an era obsessed with modesty, it's no surprise that Victorian advertisements for menstrual products were the verbal equivalent of hiding a rag in a locked drawer and pretending it was a doily. Marketers faced the impossible task of selling something that everyone needed, but no one dared to name. The result? Some of the most convoluted, cryptic, and downright hilarious product descriptions in advertising history. Picture the scene. You open your favorite ladies' magazine, perhaps The Queen or Godey's Ladies' Book, expecting tips for embroidery or a new cake recipe. But then, tucked among the latest news from Paris and moral advice from the vicar, you see it, a small boxed ad. It promises peace of mind for sensitive souls or the discreet assurance of comfort during life's recurring cycles. If you didn't already know what it meant, you certainly wouldn't figure it out from the flowery language. The manufacturers of sanitary belts, pads, and ladies' cloths never showed their products in illustrations. Heaven forbid an actual drawing should appear and send the reader into fits. Instead, their ads featured women walking serenely in a park, riding bicycles, or arranging flowers, all while wearing expressions of suspicious tranquility. The message was clear. You could face the world with confidence as long as you purchased the gentle safeguard or the monthly necessity. Brand names leaned hard into euphemism. Products were called Hygeia towels, Balm of Rest, Sylph comforts, or Dr. Lowell's private goods. Labels like for the requirements of refined women implied not only what the product was, but also that any self-respecting lady ought to keep her needs private and purchase accordingly. The bolder ones dared to mention ladies' time, but even that was often too risque for many publications. When it came to product claims, creativity was limitless. Some promised odorless protection, absolute invisibility, or soothing, silken touch. Never mind that the actual pad was the size of a small pillow, or that the belt would leave red marks on your waist for days. Advertisers insisted that their products were as light as gossamer and as comfortable as a cloud. If you suffered from delicate discomforts, there was a probably product for you, although what it actually did was left entirely up to the imagination. Direct sales, too, were handled with the delicacy of an international arms deal. Women could order by mail to avoid the shame of asking in person at the pharmacy. The goods arrived in plain brown wrappers, sometimes accompanied by a little card from the manufacturer, expressing our utmost discretion. Some companies promised that not even the postman would suspect the parcel's contents, a level of secrecy usually reserved for espionage, not menstrual supplies. Magazines occasionally published testimonials, always signed, "A Lady of Breeding" or "A Grateful Wife." These reviews praised the products for allowing renewed activity during trying times, or for making a tedious period pass unremarkably. No mention of blood, pain, or ruined petticoats, just glowing relief that no one else had to know. The effect of all this was both reassuring and infuriating. Women were glad to have new options, but the relentless secrecy reinforced the idea that their bodies were something to be hidden, controlled, and never, ever discussed. Instead of normalizing menstruation, Victorian marketing made it even more invisible, swaddled in pastel promises and gentle lies. So next time you see a modern ad that actually dares to say the word period, remember the poetic nonsense of Victorian marketing. Their delicate dance around the truth paved the way for today's blunt honesty. A revolution one cryptic tagline at a time. British women abroad faced even more challenges. Heat, humidity, and the lack of supplies meant resorting to local improvisations. Banana leaves in India, cotton scraps in Egypt, and endless cultural misunderstandings everywhere else. Victorian England prided itself on being the centre of a global empire. But for the thousands of British women who followed their husbands, fathers, or ambitions overseas, but the realities of daily life were often anything but grand. Managing a period at home was a challenge of secrecy and subtlety. Managing it abroad was an adventure in discomfort, improvisation, and sometimes wild creativity. Imagine you've just arrived in India, the air thick with heat and the promise of monsoon rains. Your carefully packed trunk contains a few linen cloths and perhaps a sanitary belt. But within days, you realize they are no match for the climate. Laundering rags is a daily ordeal. Water must be boiled. Privacy is a luxury. And nothing dries in the sticky humidity. Even worse, supplies from England are slow, expensive, and easily spoiled by the journey. You quickly learn that what worked at home doesn't stand a chance against tropical weather. Resourcefulness becomes your greatest ally. In the absence of familiar comforts, Victorian women borrowed from local traditions. In India, banana leaves, pliable and absorbent, were sometimes pressed into service, tucked into underclothes with equal parts desperation and hope. In Egypt and parts of Africa, cotton scraps or bits of locally woven fabric were pressed into duty, soaked, washed and dried as best as the climate allowed. In Australia, gum leaves and soft bark might serve in an emergency, though they left a great deal to be desired in terms of comfort. Everywhere, privacy was a problem. The houses of colonial administrators were busy places, with servants, local workers, and extended family constantly underfoot. British women learned to stash their supplies in cleverly concealed boxes or hang them discreetly on shaded verandas, always with the fear that someone might stumble across their secret stash and spark a round of cross-cultural embarrassment. The language barrier added its own challenges. Requesting extra cloth or special laundering services meant wading through a thicket of misunderstandings. Ladies' linens might be delivered to the wrong room, or a bundle of rags could be mistaken for kitchen towels. Attempts to explain the purpose of these mysterious cloths often resulted in confusion, giggles, or, occasionally, outright horror. Then there was the problem of pain. Victorian remedies, hot bricks, herbal teas, or a glass of sherry were hard to find in the tropics. Instead, women turned to whatever was on hand: cooling compresses, traditional herbs, or simply enduring in silence. Some found comfort in the methods of local women, who offered advice on using plant fibers, local oils, or particular folding techniques. Others clung to the old ways, stubbornly insisting that only English cloths and customs would do, no matter how impractical. Menstrual taboos took on new layers in the colonies. British women were already trained to hide every aspect of their cycles. But living among cultures with different attitudes toward menstruation could be both liberating and terrifying. In some places, periods were seen as unclean or unlucky, leading to further isolation. In others, women were more open, treating the monthly cycle as an ordinary fact of life, a revelation to Victorian sensibilities raised on secrecy. Through it all, women forged connections in their shared struggles. Expatriate communities became their own support networks, with experienced old hands teaching new arrivals the best tricks for laundering, improvising, and staying cool. Supplies were traded and shared, tips whispered at tea parties, and solidarity built over shared adversity. The hardships of period management abroad could be a source of loneliness, but also of resilience and new friendships. So next time you grumble about running out of supplies on a trip, spare a thought for the Victorian women navigating empires, monsoons, and the endless creativity required to survive that time of the month far from home. Their resourcefulness, sometimes awkward, sometimes inspired, reminds us that necessity, even at its most inconvenient, is always the mother of invention. Early suffragettes actually did talk about menstruation, quietly, but bravely. They argued that if women were to be taken seriously, their natural functions shouldn't be treated like moral crimes. It was radical, scandalous, and absolutely necessary. In an era when the word period could barely be whispered, talking openly about menstruation was nothing short of revolutionary. Victorian society insisted on feminine silence, polite, invisible, and forever on best behavior. But the first wave of feminists, the bold women who gathered in drawing rooms and lecture halls to demand the vote, saw this silence as both a symptom and a cause of women's oppression. If women couldn't even acknowledge a normal bodily function, how could they ever hope to speak about injustice, education, or their own ambitions? The early feminists, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Emily Davies, Josephine Butler, and countless unnamed campaigners, knew the power of challenging the monthly taboo. Some were doctors or nurses, others teachers or activists, but all faced the same obstacles. A society that treated periods as private shame, and a male establishment eager to keep it that way. Even within the suffrage movement, there was disagreement. Some felt it was too indecent, too distracting from the main cause. But others believed, with good reason, that real progress required honesty about women's lives. Not just in politics, but in every parlor, classroom, and hospital ward. Women's magazines began to publish, ever so carefully, advice columns about female health. These columns danced around the subject with coded language, but sometimes, buried in the gentle phrases, there were practical tips: how to manage cramps, what to eat, and the importance of rest. It was a quiet breakthrough, a sign that women could help each other, even if society wouldn't. Nurses and doctors in women-run hospitals became advocates for better hygiene, more comfortable products, and, most subversively, compassion for period pain. If a woman fainted from cramps in a factory or school, the new feminists said she deserved care, not mockery or dismissal. For many suffragettes, menstruation was also a political issue. If women were to participate fully in public life, the world needed to accept that they bled, felt pain, and, nevertheless, could think, speak, and vote. A delicate constitution could no longer be an excuse to keep women from higher education or public office. Some medical feminists published pamphlets arguing that women's health needed real attention, not just for the sake of productivity, but for dignity. They called out doctors who dismissed period pain as hysteria and argued that women's bodies were not frail, but simply human. Even so, discussing periods in public was fraught with risk. The backlash could be severe: accusations of vulgarity, threats to personal reputation, and sometimes outright exclusion from polite society. Letters to the editor challenging taboos might be printed unsigned or under pseudonyms. Speaking up took real courage. But the persistence of these women, over years and decades, slowly changed the landscape. The fact that a schoolgirl could eventually learn doctors eventually marketed looser hygienic corsets as better for women's health. Basically a scam to sell the same product with fewer ribs broken. But some women embraced them as a subtle rebellion. Comfort disguised as compliance. Victorian fashion has a reputation for being as restrictive as the era's social codes. And nowhere was this more literal than in the corset. For decades, doctors and moralists debated the dangers of tight lacing, blaming everything from headaches to infertility on this staple of the female wardrobe. Yet, change comes slowly, especially when it threatens the profit margins of dressmakers and the pride of the upper class. Enter the medical corset, a device hailed as the answer to every mother's prayer and every husband's hope for a healthy, still wasteless wife. Marketed as hygienic or orthopedic, the medical corset was advertised as being looser, softer, and friendlier to the female form. Some had extra lacing, wider bands, or padding at pressure points. They promised support for the back, relief from menstrual pain, and even improved digestion. Never mind that their close cousins were still being used to squeeze women into impossible silhouettes. Ads showed healthy women taking brisk walks or playing croquet. Their figures still hourglass-shaped, but with a wholesome glow only a reforming corset could allegedly provide. Doctors lined up to endorse these new garments, writing letters to magazines and giving lectures on the benefits of rational dress. Some went so far as to claim that the right corset could ease cramps, improve posture, and even regulate a woman's nervous disposition. For Victorian women who'd endured years of bruised ribs and shallow breaths, this sounded miraculous. It was, after all, a medical device, endorsed by men of science and sold at respectable apothecaries. Of course, the medical corset was still a corset. It might have used softer fabrics or allowed a little more room for expansion during a woman's period, but it rarely departed from the basic shape and structure. Women were still expected to maintain a narrow waist and upright posture. Comfort was secondary to aesthetics. If you loosened your laces too much, you risked social censure or accusations of laziness. The goal was to appear sensible, not slovenly. In this way, the medical corset was the perfect Victorian compromise. Change everything just enough that nothing really changed at all. And yet, for many women, these new corsets were a quiet liberation. The slight loosening, the extra padding, the allowance for a little swelling during delicate times, all were small victories in a world where bodily comfort was rarely prioritized. Some women, especially those involved in the rational dress movement or early feminism, seized on the medical corset as an opportunity for further rebellion. They wore them beneath looser dresses, advocating for comfort in both public and private. Mothers advised their daughters to choose health over fashion, quietly defying the old rules one day, one dress at a time. Skepticism remained, of course. Some women, especially those on the lower rungs of the social ladder, viewed medical corsets as yet another scheme to separate them from their wages. Others, worn down by years of tight lacing, doubted that any corset, medical or otherwise, could really deliver on its promises. Doctors continued to debate, dressmakers continued to advertise, and women themselves adapted as best they could. Mothers, aunts, and midwives quietly passed down survival tips: how to fold cloths properly, treat stains, and hide supplies from judgmental eyes. These whispered lessons were acts of solidarity in a world that offered none. Victorian society demanded silence about menstruation, but women themselves refused to let each other suffer alone. While fathers and brothers remained blissfully unaware, and etiquette manuals avoided the topic entirely, a shadow network of female wisdom quietly flourished. It was in the flicker-lit kitchens after supper, the quiet corners of sewing circles, or late at night when daughters tiptoed to their mothers' bedsides with confused questions and trembling hands. Here, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the truth about the monthly was gently, lovingly revealed. The first lesson was always practical. Folding. Mothers demonstrated how to double or triple a rag for heavier days, how to roll the edges for a softer fit, and how to pin everything securely in place without poking yourself. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about managing leaks, limiting laundry, and preserving every precious scrap of cloth. Girls learned which fabrics absorbed best, which stained least, and how to test a new piece before trusting it in public. "Old flannel is your best friend," an aunt might whisper, "but nothing beats soft linen if you can find it." Next came stain removal, a science in itself. While store-bought soap was a luxury, women swapped homemade concoctions: a paste of salt and lemon, a dab of vinegar, or even ashes from last night's fire. The trick: everyone agreed, was cold water first, then patience. If a stain wouldn't budge, you hid it inside the folds or assigned that cloth to days spent entirely at home. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a second or third life. Discretion was the third pillar of wisdom. Supplies were tucked into pockets sewn inside skirts or hidden in secret drawers and old biscuit tins. Daughters were warned never to leave a rag unattended, especially in houses full of children, curious husbands, or sharp-eyed housekeepers. If an emergency arose while out visiting, women invented ingenious ruses to avoid embarrassment, faking a sudden chill to fetch a shawl, requesting a tour of the garden to slip away, or volunteering to help in the kitchen just to escape to a private corner. The real test of maturity wasn't just handling your period, but managing everyone else's ignorance of it. Perhaps most important, though, were the lessons about endurance and self-compassion. It's normal to feel tired. A grandmother might reassure. You're not weak, just human. In a world that treated any sign of physical discomfort as a moral failing, these quiet reminders were lifelines. Stories were shared about mothers who gave birth while cooking supper, or great-aunts who managed a farm and 6 children, all while fighting through pain each month. These tales didn't erase the hardship, but they made it bearable and reminded each new generation that she was not alone. By the late Victorian era, hygiene reformers began connecting menstruation to public health. Soap, plumbing, and cotton pads started creeping into middle-class life. For the first time, the period conversation shifted from shame to science, though awkwardly, and in Latin. The final decades of the Victorian age witnessed a transformation not just in industry and politics, but also in the way people thought about health. For generations, menstruation had been shrouded in secrecy and superstition. But as germ theory and public health reforms swept through England's crowded cities, even the monthly mystery could not escape the bright and sometimes blinding light of science. It started with the rise of the hygienic home. Reformers published pamphlets urging families to scrub, air, and disinfect every room. Cleanliness became a new virtue, advertised by soap companies and medical men alike. Plumbing advanced, bringing indoor toilets and running water to wealthier households. Suddenly, washing menstrual cloths wasn't quite as daunting, though privacy, as ever, remained at a premium. For many, this meant less risk of infection and more confidence in managing the monthly routine. Doctors, now armed with microscopes and a growing understanding of bacteria, turned their attention to women's health. Medical journals, full of complicated Latin, warned that improper management of the menses could lead to everything from anemia to mysterious female derangements. For the first time, the advice was less about shame and more about sanitation. Use clean cloth, change frequently, wash with soap and water, not just cold water from the well. Avoid sharing supplies. It was basic advice by modern standards, but revolutionary in a world where even saying period aloud could draw scandalized glances. Middle-class women, eager to embrace modernity, began to invest in better supplies. Commercially produced cotton pads, though still clunky and expensive, became available to those who could afford them. Sanitary belts, no matter how awkward, were marketed as scientific solutions, complete with endorsements from real doctors. Even the advertisements, while still steeped in euphemism, began to hint at a future where menstruation might be acknowledged as normal, if not yet entirely discussable. Brands included words like health, hygienic, and approved by the faculty, as if buying a pad was practically an act of public service. Soap, once a precious commodity, became more accessible. Women experimented with different brands and scents, comparing notes with neighbors and reading reviews in ladies' magazines. It was not uncommon to find articles praising the antiseptic properties of new toilet soaps, sometimes accompanied by stern warnings about female cleanliness. The message was clear. Cleanliness wasn't just for show. It was now a moral, scientific duty. Schools, too, began to change, albeit slowly. Health education remained minimal and usually delivered in whispered tones. But girls might hear, at least, that periods were a normal part of life, requiring sensible care and good hygiene. Reformers lobbied for better instruction, cleaner facilities, and the presence of female teachers who could offer advice and understanding. In factories and large institutions, the idea of providing clean washrooms, rest areas, and access to sanitary supplies gained ground, though progress was uneven and usually reserved for the privileged few. There were no cute heating pads or discreet boxes labelled period care in Victorian bedrooms. Instead, a lady's emergency kit might include a folded cloth, a bottle of vinegar, and a prayer. Some kept salt on hand to ward off fainting. Others had smelling salts to revive themselves. After realizing they'd bled through a petticoat worth more than their maid's yearly wages. Everything was improvised, hidden, and always inconvenient, because the era's greatest fear was not blood, but acknowledging that women were human. For a Victorian woman, preparation was less about convenience and more about desperate necessity. You never knew when your period would arrive. Calendars, after all, were for royal balls and planting potatoes, not for tracking personal cycles. So you kept a tiny arsenal close at hand, stashed in a nightstand, under a pillow, or inside a locked drawer nobody dared open. The kit was humble, a few scraps of linen or flannel, sometimes pre-folded for speed, a small bottle of vinegar to cleanse stains, and, if rumours were true, keep away evil spirits. A bar of strong-smelling soap, much prized for its supposed purifying power, and a tin of smelling salts for emergencies of both the fainting and social varieties. Smelling salts were a fixture in any self-respecting woman's bedside drawer. Fainting was not just a risk from tight corsets or the emotional trauma of everyday Victorian life. It was also a handy excuse for a strategic retreat from embarrassing situations. If you felt a dizzy spell coming on, you'd quickly reach for the little vial, unscrew the top, and inhale the acrid fumes. A quick swoon could buy you a moment's escape or, at the very least, distract everyone from the suspicious rustle of linen beneath your skirts. A few kept salt or sugar cubes to suck on if weakness struck. A tip passed down through mothers and midwives. Old wives' tales claimed it steadied the nerves and fortified the blood. These were more psychological than medicinal, but in a world short on real relief, a placebo with family backing was worth its weight in gold. Other emergency supplies included an extra petticoat for strategic layering on heavy days, a small sewing kit to repair any garment disaster before it became public knowledge, and perhaps a sachet of lavender or rose to help mask the scent of iron and vinegar. Some added a soft handkerchief, not just for dabbing away tears or sweat, but for cleaning stains or, in a pinch, doubling as a pad when supplies ran low. Discretion ruled all decisions. Even in your own bedroom, there was always the risk of a maid, a sibling, or an inquisitive child stumbling upon your kit. Supplies were hidden in plain sight, camouflaged among perfectly respectable belongings. If questioned, you'd claim that the linen was for dusting, the vinegar for cleaning silver, and the soap for washing hands. Smelling salts? A necessity for delicate ladies, of course. By the 1870s, medical inventors started proposing new solutions for female hygiene, each more nightmarish than the last. There were metal catamenial receivers, early menstrual cups made of rubber, and something charmingly named the ladies' retaining device. These contraptions were supposed to bring dignity, but most looked like tiny torture chairs designed by someone who'd never met a woman. Doctors claimed they promoted female efficiency. Women quietly called them the reason I'm not leaving the house today. The late Victorian period was an age of innovation: steam engines, telegraphs, bicycles, and, in the more obscure corners of medical history, some of the strangest period products the world has ever seen. Emboldened by new materials like rubber and metal, inventors began churning out patents for contraptions meant to modernize menstruation and save women from the drudgery of boiling cloths and hiding stains. If you were lucky enough to flip through the back pages of a medical supply catalogue, you might encounter illustrations of devices that looked more at home in a dentist's nightmare than a lady's boudoir. The metal catamenial receiver was one such marvel. Essentially a cup attached to a belt or set of straps, it was designed to collect menstrual blood internally, an early and extremely optimistic ancestor of the menstrual cup. Unfortunately, the available technology left much to be desired. Rubber, in its infancy, was prone to cracking, hardening, or leaking, while poorly designed metal cups were uncomfortable, heavy, and alarmingly cold on a winter's morning. Instructions on insertion and removal read like cryptic treasure maps, and most women preferred the old rag to a science experiment gone wrong. Not to be outdone, some inventors rolled out the ladies' retaining device, a name so blandly euphemistic that it could have described anything from a corset to a chastity belt. This ingenious gadget was designed to retain the monthly flow, promising leak-proof security for the modern woman. Advertisements showed drawings of contented ladies riding bicycles or attending lectures, but real-life users quickly discovered that the device was less a liberator and more a source of panic. Slippage, pinching, and the constant threat of malfunction meant every outing became a calculated risk. Sitting down too quickly could result in a clang audible across the parlor. There were other marvels: menstrual shields, baffles, and guards of various materials, some featuring elaborate locking mechanisms padded with wool or rubber. One model was essentially a miniature hammock suspended between the legs, held in place by a harness and, one assumes, prayer. Patent records from the era are full of breathless claims: absolute comfort, undetectable under the most fashionable attire. But the testimonials were few and usually anonymous. Doctors, always eager to promote new scientific advances, lined up to recommend these devices in medical journals and women's magazines. They claimed the gadgets would free women from the chains of traditional cloth, reduce the risk of infection, and, best of all, allow them to be more productive wives, mothers, and workers. What these well-meaning men failed to consider was how little most women wanted a cold, creaking apparatus wedged anywhere near their dignity. Scent was serious business. A lady's reputation could literally hinge on her fragrance, especially during her time. Some soaked rags in rosewater or cologne before use, creating what can only be described as the world's first scented sanitary pad. The result? Bedrooms that smelled like a combination of funeral flowers, iron, and despair. Perfume makers cashed in with euphemistically named blends like Essence of Freshness and Purity No. 7, none of which could overpower the reality of 12. Layers of damp fabric and crushed dignity. In a world with limited running water, unreliable laundry, and clothes that spent more time hiding sweat than reflecting light, the role of perfume in Victorian England cannot be overstated. If you were a woman of means, your dresser top was lined with glass bottles filled with lavender, rose, jasmine, or musk, each chosen for a particular social occasion or personal anxiety. But during your period, fragrance was not simply a luxury. It was a survival tool. Menstruation, with its attendant smells and stains, was a source of genuine terror for the etiquette-minded Victorian lady. The threat of discovery, by family, servants, or guests, haunted every waking moment. With discreet laundry impossible, and bloodstains harder to hide than a runaway horse, scent became both shield and sword. Enterprising women, desperate to mask any hint of female inconvenience, would sprinkle rosewater or lavender onto their rags and petticoats, creating what they hoped was an aura of innocent floral freshness. The results, as you might expect, were mixed. In the privacy of your bedroom, the combined aroma of perfume and iron, the latter courtesy of menstrual blood, was memorable, a nose-wrinkling blend of sweet and metallic, sharp and powdery. No matter how much essence of freshness you splashed around, there was no fully masking the scent of reality. Many women worried that their attempts to cover up the smell only drew more attention, making a simple day at home feel like a prolonged audition for the part of walking bouquet at a vampire's wedding. Perfume makers, ever alert to an opportunity, churned out new products for the delicate days. Ad copy boasted of special blends guaranteed to mask the most persistent odors or bestow confidence on the most sensitive occasions. Of course, the real source of confidence would have been effective sanitation, but that was a problem no one was ready to discuss. As a result, Victorian pharmacies sold not only perfume, but also sachets, scented powders, and colognes, all marketed as indispensable to the discreet lady. For the less affluent, homemade options were the only recourse. A sprig of mint, a sachet of dried lavender from the garden, or a lemon peel tucked into a handkerchief might serve as both comfort and camouflage. If you were truly desperate, vinegar, believed to be cleansing and deodorizing, could be dabbed beneath the arms or on rags, ensuring that the only thing more eye-watering than your cramps was the air around you. In the shadow of industrial smoke, working-class women faced the hardest realities. Factory shifts were long, breaks were rare, and bathrooms, if they existed, were shared by hundreds. Many women simply folded a bit of rag into their bloomers and hoped for the best. Stains weren't a moral failing, they were an occupational hazard. Yet even as they worked 14-hour days surrounded by grease and gears, they were told to be modest and refined. Victorian feminism didn't just begin in parlours. It began here, with women who bled, sweated, and kept going anyway. The rise of the factory was one of the defining changes of the Victorian era, transforming the rhythm of daily life for millions. But for working-class women, these new opportunities came with brutal trade-offs. Imagine entering the clattering, smoky floors of a textile mill, metal foundry, or matchstick factory, already exhausted, and knowing your period has just arrived. There's no time for rest. The machines never stop, and neither can you. Supplies were always limited. Factory girls could not afford the luxury of finely woven linens or commercial pads. Instead, they repurposed whatever scraps they could find. Cut-up shirts, pieces of old blankets, even cast-off wool or flannel salvaged from the factory floor. Some days, a bit of rag was all that stood between you and a public disaster. These rags had to last the entire shift and be reused for weeks, sometimes months. There was rarely a chance to clean or change them during working hours. The facilities made things worse. Most Victorian factories provided a single privy, an outdoor toilet, often little more than a wooden bench over a hole in the ground. Hundreds of women shared it, and privacy was non-existent. You waited in line, praying that your cloth would hold out a little longer. If you were lucky, you might have a few moments behind a partition to check for stains or adjust your makeshift pad. More often, you simply had to endure, doing your best to ignore discomfort and embarrassment. Accidents were common, with long hours, heavy lifting, and constant movement. Even the most carefully pinned rag could shift or leak. Stains on a skirt or petticoat were not unusual. Among fellow workers, there was little judgment. Everyone understood the realities, and solidarity ran deep. If a friend spotted a stain, she'd quietly pull you aside or offer her shawl for cover. Women watched out for one another in a world that never made their burdens easier. Health risks were real and relentless. Dirty rags, limited access to soap and water, and the pressure to keep working led to frequent infections, rashes, and chronic pain. Medical care was a luxury few could afford, and complaints about cramps or discomfort were often dismissed by overseers as laziness or malingering. Absenteeism, even for a day, could mean losing your job, and with it, the income that kept your family fed. Despite everything, resilience flourished. Factory women became experts in stealth, improvisation, and mutual support. They developed silent signals for emergencies, shared tips on the best materials for makeshift pads, and sometimes pooled money to buy better supplies for those in dire need. Out of necessity, they created their own underground network, a sisterhood forged in hardship and empathy. By the turn of the 20th century, whispers of change began rustling through the endless petticoats. Hygiene became a topic of reform. Women's health advocates emerged. And suddenly, menstruation wasn't just a private struggle, it was a public issue. Pamphlets spoke of modern womanhood and scientific cleanliness. The taboo cracked, if not shattered. And in that small but profound shift, from silence to speech, Victorian women planted the seed for every menstrual revolution to come. They endured ridicule, discomfort, and countless ruined skirts so the next generation could buy a tampon without blushing. The last years of the Victorian era were a period of contradiction, still clinging to the old but peering ahead into the new. On the surface, little seemed to have changed. Women still wore corsets, etiquette reigned, and the topic of menstruation was shrouded in polite silence. But underneath, a subtle revolution was underway, led not by banners and speeches, but by everyday choices and small acts of resistance. Reformers began to challenge the narrative that menstruation was shameful or unhealthy. Writers, doctors, and activists started publishing pamphlets and articles on the hygiene of womanhood. These were often filled with flowery prose and coded language, but the message was clear. Women's bodies were not dirty or defective. They deserved cleanliness, comfort, and above all, dignity. The very act of printing the words, however cautiously, was radical. It made it possible for mothers to have honest conversation with their daughters, and for women to start demanding better products and better treatment. Education played a key role. New generations of women attended schools and colleges in growing numbers, where the whisper network of practical advice became more organized. Girls learned about menstrual hygiene in health classes, still rare and sometimes awkward, but a world away from the silence their mothers endured. School nurses offered advice and comfort, and pamphlets from women's organizations appeared in dormitories and teachers' lounges, normalizing what had once been unspeakable. Hygiene reform was also sweeping through public policy. City councils and social reformers campaigned for cleaner water, public baths, and improved sewage. Investments that made it possible for women to manage their periods more safely and discreetly. Factories and offices began, however slowly, to provide cleaner washrooms. Soap became cheaper and more widely available, and advertisements shifted from pure euphemism to a new language of scientific cleanliness. The arrival of commercial pads and belts, once rejected as too daring, began to feel modern and sensible. What once inspired embarrassment now offered a sense of empowerment. At the heart of these changes was women's own insistence on being heard. Suffragettes and labor leaders alike spoke, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, about the realities of women's health. Periods became a rallying point for demands for shorter working hours, better pay, and safer conditions. The refusal to stay silent, whether in a factory meeting or at a kitchen table, became the engine of progress. Yet, for all the change, the revolution was gentle, almost invisible to outsiders. Women still handed down wisdom behind closed doors. Sisterhood thrived in late-night conversations, shared remedies, and whispered support. It was the slow work of a million individual decisions, choosing comfort, asking questions, helping a friend, or daring to say, "I need help," without shame. The quiet revolution beneath the petticoats was never one moment, but a gathering force, a promise that the next generation would not be left in the dark. So, as you unwrap a pad or talk openly about your own cycle, remember the silent pioneers of the Victorian age. Their courage in the face of ridicule and repression laid the path for every menstrual product, every honest conversation, and every bit of dignity we claim today. So tonight, as you lie back in your clean bed, on a mattress